Okay, in the last video, we introduced Mill's consequentialist theory of morality, according to which an action is good to the extent that it increases happiness, where happiness means everyone's happiness or the overall happiness across all people, and an action is bad to the extent that it decreases happiness. Now we'll look at some objections to that theory. The first objection comes in two forms, and it says that Mill's theory is too demanding. One version of the theory says it requires too much sacrifice of us. So let's look at a version of this objection. Here we have a utilitarian dad. That's what the UD stands for. And we have the son. That's what the S stands for. And the son says, "Daddy, I've been saving all the pennies I can find. I have $2 and I'm going to buy this candy bar." And the dad says, being a utilitarian, "Look, if you donate that $2, it could feed a starving child in a country for weeks. Is the happiness that you'll get from the candy really what a starving child would get from a week of food?" And the kid says no. And the dad says, "Well, then you know what the best thing to do is. You should donate the $2. And the kid says okay and donates the $2. And the idea here is that this example isn't unique. Almost everything you do in your life, not just money you spend, but every action you perform is not the action that maximizes overall happiness. So every time you buy a candy bar, every time you buy a second pair of shoes, every time you choose to watch a TV show, every time you sleep in, every time you choose to read a novel that you'll enjoy, you're doing something that is such that some other course of action, donating the money you use to buy the shoes, researching world poverty and how to fix it during the time that you're watching the TV show, or volunteering at a local shelter during the time that you're reading the novel, or whatever, you're doing something such that some other course of action would increase happiness more than the action that you're performing. So it seems the utilitarian theory says you ought to be performing one of those other actions. And you can see that this would demand a life of sort of total sacrifice, always just pursuing what's best for the world at the expense of your own interests. Now, here's Mill's main response. He says, first, so what? Why should we expect doing the morally best thing to be easy? It's not a criticism of the theory to say that it requires a lot of us. Maybe morality requires a lot of us. And then Mill says, but maybe it doesn't actually require quite so much. And here's his idea. He says, you're most likely to produce the best possible effect on world happiness if you know relevant facts. So, for example, if I don't know what's going to make you happy, or how to get you what I want, how to get you what you want, even if I do know what's going to make you happy, then I'm not going to be well positioned to do anything to make you happy. And quite often, I don't know what you want. And quite often, even when I do know what you want, I don't know how best to get it to you. Whereas, I always know what I want. And I always have a good idea of how to go about getting it. And everybody else is sort of like somewhere between me and people I don't know. So the more I know about you, the better positioned I am to maximize happiness for you. And the more less I know about you, the less well positioned I am to maximize happiness for you. Well, I know a lot about those people close to me. I know a lot about myself, and I know quite a bit about those people close to me. And I know less and less as people get more and more distant. So we should expect that as people get more and more distant from me, I will be less and less effective at performing in a way that will increase their happiness. So maybe the theory isn't too demanding because it allows you to focus on maximizing happiness for yourself and those close to you. Now, I think this reply that Mill gives to the objection gets something right and gets something wrong. What it gets right is that it's true that typically we know relevant facts about ourselves and those near to us, and that knowing these facts will help us be better at increasing the happiness of ourselves and those near us. What it gets wrong is that often you don't need to know all that much to know that you could spend your time in ways that would increase happiness more than the way that you're spending your time. So, for example, take the kid with the candy bar. Even if the kid doesn't know much about which charities are best and most efficient in distributing resources to people in another country, and even if the kid doesn't know much about the people in that other country, let's just say like Bangladesh. There's a lot of poverty in Bangladesh. So even if the kid doesn't know much about people in Bangladesh and doesn't know much about how to get charitable donations to people in Bangladesh, the kid still knows, just based on his general understanding of what human beings are like, that getting some amount of money to those people in Bangladesh who are starving will bring them more happiness than he's going to get from the candy bar. So he still knows that donating the money will bring about more happiness than will come from the candy bar, even if 80% of the donation goes to the people working at the charity rather than the intended recipients of the charity. It's still the case that happiness will be increased more through that donation than by the kid buying the candy bar. So it still seems like on Mill's theory, even given this reply, a lot will be demanded of us. There's another response to this objection, and it goes like this. For Kant, an action is either moral, amoral, or immoral. So an action is morally praiseworthy if the opposite of the rule you're following when you perform that action leads to a contradiction when universalized. An action is morally blameworthy if the rule you're following leads to a contradiction when universalized. And an action is immoral if neither the opposite of the rule you're following nor the rule you're following lead to a contradiction when universalized. So every action falls into one of these three groups. There's no room for gradation. So it's like murdering a whole bunch of people and stealing a penny they're just both morally bad. There's no way to sort of measure the degree of badness. They both violate a moral rule. They're both morally bad. By contrast, for Mill, morality comes in degrees. The more happiness you create, the better the action. So we can say that the kid buying the candy bar, because it creates some happiness, is morally good to some extent. Of course, donating the money would be morally good to a greater extent, but that doesn't make eating the candy bar bad. It just means it's not as good as it could have been. Correspondingly, you might think not so much is demanded of us. It doesn't demand too much sacrifice because it doesn't really demand anything. It just is a way to evaluate the extent to which an action is morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. Okay. Another version of the too demanding objection says it's too complicated. We're never going to be able to figure out what's morally good or morally bad if Mill is right. And again, we'll use the utilitarian dad to illustrate this point. Here we have the dad choosing between some organic tomatoes and some conventional tomatoes. He's going to buy a single tomato, and he says, which one should I buy, the organic or the conventional? And then he goes through a reasoning process. He thinks, well, look, I'm going to be a good utilitarian dad, and I want to maximize happiness with this action, with this purchase. So let me think through the consequences of buying one versus buying the other. On the one hand, no pesticides were used in producing the organic ones, which is better for the farm workers, so maybe I should go for the organic. On the other hand, the conventional tomatoes were locally grown, which means less fuel was burned in getting them to me, and that benefits everyone a little, especially people in vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, given the perils of global warming. So maybe I should choose the conventional. On the other hand, it's winter here, but not in Mexico, where organic tomatoes come from, and maybe the total fuel consumed in growing those organic tomatoes and getting them to me is actually less than the total fuel consumed in growing these conventional tomatoes grown nearby and getting them to me, because it takes so much fuel to run the greenhouses. On the other hand, the organic tomatoes cost quite a bit more, and if I buy all conventional fruits and veggies over here, I'm going to save about $50 a week, which I could donate to people or use for some political cause that I think is good or whatever. On the other hand, organic farming is more sustainable, and so ultimately hungry people may benefit more from everyone shopping organic. Moreover, there are slightly more nutrients in that food, so maybe I can buy a little less. And eventually your head's going to explode. You're going to go back and forth, and there's a million considerations pushing in each direction, and you're never going to be able to figure it out. You're never going to be able to do something as simple as buy a tomato. Now, suppose we measure happiness on a scale from -10 to +10. You can think of it like this. I'm going to consider the happiness for me for buying the organic tomato versus the conventional tomato, the happiness for one farm worker, the happiness for another farm worker, and another farm worker, and another farm worker, and a farm owner. And I'm going to consider the happiness for the hungry people to whom I otherwise might send food. I'm going to consider the happiness of everybody on the planet since global warming comes into play. All of this seems like it's relevant to figuring out which action is best. Moreover, there might be distinctions between me in the short term, which one's better for me in the short term versus which one's better for me in the long term. And the same thing might hold for the farm workers and the hungry people and so on and so forth. And consequently, I'm going to need to do some incredibly complicated investigation and calculation to do something as simple as figure out which tomato to buy. Well, that's a lot to ask. So how can you respond? Well, Mill suggests, look, if you focus on you and those closest to you, which is maybe what you should do, then it's not going to be so hard. He also says, why should figuring out what's morally good be easy? No one says, quantum field theory in physics or the standard model in particle physics is false because it's hard to figure out or hard to understand. They say it's hard to understand, it's complex, but that's the way the world is. So I'm going to take it the way it is and believe that it's true. Similarly, says Mill, you shouldn't say that a moral theory is false because it's hard to understand or it says it's, morality is complex or whatever. You should take it the way it is and say the theory is true if it's true and false if it's not, regardless of how complex or difficult it is to understand. Okay, Mill also says maybe we can rely on shortcuts that make things a bit easier. Okay, that's one set of objections. The next set of objections starts with talk of slaves, and we'll pick that up next time.